Hello everyone. In this lesson we will take a look at one of the simplest but at the same time spectacular types of logo reveals. Reveal by lines. Here we will mainly use trim path and 3D stroke, and enhance their effect with the help of additional elements and various effects. We will figure out the basic techniques of reveal by lines on practical examples. For the most part, we will talk about text and stroke logos. This technique looks great on these two. Let's start with how to build your workflow in an optimal way. In general, the pipeline is as follows. Prepare the logo for the animation. Transfer it into shapes. Separate parts of the logo that will be animated individually. At this stage, it is important to understand what kind of animation you want to get, how the logo elements will appear, whether the whole thing will be drawn in one line or each letter will be drawn separately. Perhaps you'd like the letters or parts of the logo to be made up of a large number of elements, or to be cut, as in this example. After that, create paths on which the lines will move, or masks that will reveal the logo. The next step is to get right to the reveal animation of the basic elements. Usually, it is enough to animate one of the elements and simply copy the timings and easings to similar ones. This way you will save a lot of time, and the only thing you will need to take care of is offsets between the layers. When the base is ready, you can make the animation more expressive by adding more elements and stylization, or by creating such an effect of appearing layer by layer. Since we are done with the pipeline, let's move on to the techniques that I talked about in the beginning. Let's start with the most commonly used trim paths and stroke. Here I've identified three main blocks. Drawing letters and elements of the logo. Compiling a logo from lines. Using lines as additional elements. Let's start with the first one. Everything is quite simple here. There are two main ways of revealing letters. The first one is to draw a mask along the outline of the letter and use the stroke effect to reveal it. And the second one is to use the regular shape line with a stroke, which will be revealed by trim paths and serve as a mask for the letter. Let's start with the first one. Draw a mask. Try to draw it exactly in the middle of the letter's outline. When the mask is ready, apply the stroke effect. In the effects control of the layer, adjust the width of the stroke and set brush hardness to 100 to remove blurring edges. By using spacing, you can make a line of dots, but we don't need it for now, so let's set it to 0. Now we animate the start and end parameters in the stroke effect. They are responsible for the reveal of the line. They work in exactly the same way as in the trim paths shape modifier. Set up the speed graphs, with a sharp start and smooth ending. When the animation is ready, change the paint style parameter. You need to change the unoriginal image mode to reveal original image. The first mode created a stroke of a given width for the specified mask, while reveal will display a layer image along this stroke. Done. The main drawback of this method is the inability to change the edge of the mask. It will always remain rounded, which sometimes does not correspond to the style of the logo. And in this case, you can use trim paths. Create a shape along the outline of the letter, just like with the mask before, and increase the width of the shape. Add trim paths to this shape. In this case, you can change the line cap and get either a rounded or an even edge. Let me make a small side note here. If you have a stair-step path, then to create an even edge, you should select projective cap instead of butt cap. This feature will help you avoid such bugs. But keep in mind that the length of the line will increase slightly at both ends. Besides, shape modifiers and effects allow us to get really interesting line setups for revealing. We'll have a look at them later. Let's get back to our letter. Now we need to make the top layer a mask using Alpha Mate and animate trim paths. The principle of animation is the same as in the stroke effect, but now I use the end parameter for the trim paths of the mask layer for the reveal. As you can see, the method with the reveal of the letter using the shape layer is much more flexible and variable. But this method also has a drawback. This is additional layers on the timeline that you should remember to attach to the main letters so that when you enlarge or move the letter, the mask repeats this movement. So the animation of the letter is ready. I've animated all the other letters in the same way and offset them. Not bad, but I want to add expressiveness to it. The easiest way is to duplicate all the letters or elements, repaint them in a different color, and make a small offset. The number of copies should not be more than 3 or 4. Otherwise, the animation will look dirty and confusing. When changing the color of elements, try to use only the palette of the logo, so as to not violate the overall style. A similar technique is very often used in lettering or in logos with multicolored letters. Now that we are done with the reveal of the letters, let's move on. Making up a logo from lines is a commonly used technique that lets you get completely different results. To each of the cases, there are certain subtleties that we will look at in practice. The simplest and most obvious way is to form parts of the logo from moving straight lines. You can do this very easily. In order to create this kind of letter movement, I use a path with the trim paths modifier. You can also create tilt using the skew parameter. This way, the top and the bottom of the letter will always remain horizontal when tilted. Draw a straight line. Move the anchor point of the layer and shape to the upper left corner using motion tools. You need this in order for skew to work correctly. In order to move the anchor point of the shape's group but not the entire layer, select this group while holding down the Alt key and click on the Move Anchor Point button on the script panel. Adjust the value of skew and the width of the stroke. Got it. Now add the trim paths and animate its start and end. The idea is that the lines should appear quickly, freeze for a moment, and then turn into a letter. Therefore, animate the beginning of the movement with the help of start and adjust the length of the line to the size of the letter using end. Good. Let's move on to the speed graphs. Make a sharp move with a slowdown towards the end. Create a short pause in the middle of the animation to enhance the effect of the letter stretching, after which there will be a sharp graph with a smooth end of the animation. And here you've got such a smooth animation. Experiments with speed graphs can help you get a variety of different moods of an entire animation. For example, if you slightly change the easing to a sharper one in the end, the stretching of the lines will be more expressive. Easing with a slowdown in the beginning and in the end, and an acceleration in the middle, will make your animation look sharper and more aggressive. Let's get back to the very first option. We still need to do the same thing to the remaining letters and set up the offsets between the layers. Here it is important to remember two things. Firstly, there should always be offsets, and secondly, they shouldn't be linear. Linear animation gets boring and predictable. Don't stop experimenting, and it will always help you find the best solution. I did the same thing here. With the help of sequence layers, I made linear offsets of 3 frames first, but it looked way too boring. Then I arranged the layers randomly, which made the animation overly chaotic and unbalanced. Therefore, the ideal solution in this case is to make linear offsets and add a little randomness to them. This technique almost always looks great, and makes animations look much more lively and interesting. In this example, straight lines turn into a logo, but we can also use arcs or spirals, just like in a Slack animation. Here the circles turn into arched lines that twist into 4 stripes of the logo. The principle remains the same. The only thing that changes is the shape of the lines and additional effects. Now let's look at another example. This is a great example of the combination of an idea and technical implementation. The animation emphasizes the sophisticated character of the logo and design elements. For example, the combination of lines and their shapes looks a bit like microchips, and the circle of the letter C resembles a watching eye or a camera. The logo is revealed quite quickly, but at the same time, the way the lines get stretched and the letters H and U are cut creates a feeling of smoothness. And that's all because of easing. The easing of each element is the same as that of the whole animation. The main part of the elements appears quickly, and then the details are added smoothly. Note that the letters in the upper row appear almost simultaneously, while in the lower row there are more obvious offsets. Similarly, at the end of the reveal of each letter, there is a smooth final movement of lines, or splitting, as in the letters H and U, which, by the way, is very simple to do. All you need is to create two rectangles, put them in the right place, and after turning off the constraint proportions, animate the Y scale from 0 to 100. Now just move this layer over the element in which there will be cuts and apply an alpha inverted matte to it. Done. As you've probably already noticed, technically everything is simple in this animation. Here we used the already familiar 2U trim paths and animation on the scale. But thanks to correctly selected timings, easings, and offsets, the work looks very cool. We've talked about the reveal of text and logo elements with the help of lines. But this is far from the only use of this technique. You can use it as an additional secondary animation, which will help emphasize the essence of what the company is doing, or just add volume to your animation. Additional elements may be similar to HUD UI, which will emphasize the sophisticated character of the logo, or will indicate the field in which the company operates. Also, it can be a kind of retrospective showing the process of creating or transforming the logo. They can also be just distracting elements that emphasize the speed and direction of movement. It is important to understand that these additional elements should help emphasize the essence, and not draw all the attention to themselves. Lines should be thin and emphasize the shape of the object or the direction of its movement. After we've examined the techniques of revealing letters, let's move on to an even more interesting technique: stroke morphings. Just like any other morphing, this is the process of turning one object into another. And in this case, I use strokes as an intermediate stage of this transformation. Let's start with the most obvious example: these words that turn into each other. The principle is very simple. A letter turns into a long one, and then it's turning into another letter. There are two ways to make such a morphing. The first one is to draw a long path, which will be the first letter, the path of the line, and the second letter. Then animate this path using the trim path. In these animations, you should pay attention to the trajectory of movement and timing. If one letter flows into another along an arched path, then this arc should repeat the shape of an ellipse or a spiral. But if it is drawn in a sloppy way, this will immediately affect the animation and the flaws will strike the eye. If you have no experience with the Bezier curves, then you will probably face some problems drawing a path for morphing. Therefore, we have a small life hack for you. When creating the path, add a circle with a thin stroke to the same layer and build a curve on top of it. So you will get a nice path that will look smooth and harmonious. Great, the morphing animation is ready. But it does not convey the style of the text itself. Any good morphing includes preparation for movement and fading, and also sometimes distracting elements that emphasize the moment or fact of transformation. Add a little preparation before morphing and fading after it ends. We will do this by animating the position and rotation of the entire layer. It is not necessary to make preparations and fading very long. Sometimes small fluctuations or movements on each letter are enough to make the text more lively and give it character. In this example, the preparation and fading have added a sense of lightness, as if the letters were made of balloons. Well, for sure you've noticed these cool trails on the final animation. We will analyze a bit later on how to do something similar. Another example of simple but effective morphing is such an animation of the Slack logo. What's noteworthy here is that the morphing of the circles in the logo line is done using the trim paths and reducing the width of the stroke. I've started by creating 4 circles in the center of the composition and turning them by 30 degrees so that each circle is perpendicular to the 2 lines of the logo. Then I've drawn a path along which the circle will morph into the logo line. I've used the circles again as patterns in order to get beautiful and smooth bends. Now add the trim path to the created shape and set the end value to 0.1, making a circle of the lines. Adjust the width of the stroke to the size of the circle. Using this parameter, we will create the reveal of the circles with bounces and their transformation into logo lines. By changing the trim path and the width parameters of the stroke, we get an animation of the circle turning into the line. The speed graph will be sharp in the beginning and smooth towards the end, so the animation will come out soft and neat. When the morphing of one circle is completely ready, you simply copy the entire layer and rotate it by 90 degrees. Also, change the color of the lines to the same as in the logo. When finished with morphings, animate the stroke width for the reveal of the circles. Let's make it fast, in 5 to 10 frames, and add elastic for damped oscillations. If we want elastic to work as it should, the speed of the last keyframe should not be 0. The lower the speed, the weaker the oscillations. Therefore, make the second keyframe simply linear. Just copy these keyframes on the remaining layers. If you click on the elastic while holding down the Alt key, then controllers with the elastic parameters will be taken out to a separate null object. This is very convenient if you need the same bounce on several layers, since you can adjust the elastic settings of all layers from one controller layer, without going into the control effects of each of them. It remains to parent the layers to the null so that it becomes a point around which the entire composition will rotate. Don't forget to make sure that the anchor point of the null is exactly in the center of the composition. Otherwise, the circles will not rotate symmetrically. The rotation graph will be the same as for the morphing of lines. This way we'll set the general easing of the entire logo animation. It will have a sharp start and a smooth end. Great, the rotation is done. Now add the offsets and the animation is finished. That was the first way to create morphing. Let's move on to the second one. They are similar in many aspects, but the second one is used in those cases when you cannot recreate the logo using the usual trim path, or when you already have several morphings that need to be done one by one, and drawing a long path would take too much time and effort. In this case, you can use a simple replacement. For example, take this animation. Here the thickness of the letters and lines is not the same, so using a solid line with a trim path as we did before won't work. This time I've made the reveal of the letter separately, and at the moment when the line is touching the letter, I've turned on the animation of the reveal. This technique is very often used in lettering, which you will talk about in detail in a couple of lessons. To make the morphing to go smooth and quiet, you need to do two things. First, select the width of the stroke at the point of replacing the line with the letters so that the transition looks smooth and organic. And secondly, maintain the overall morphing speed. As you already know, morphing almost always occurs at the peak speed, and the animation of the lines here is no exception. If it's difficult for you to fine-tune the graphs by eye, there is a small life hack. Do morphing in the first way when the line and the object are one path. Set up easings. And now just fit your two animations, line morphing and letter manifestation, under this base. Animation of all elements should be perceived as a whole. Imagine that all the animations have a single easing, for example with a slow start, fast morphing, and smooth ending. Thus the easings of each part of the animation must adapt to the general one. The main advantage of this method is that you can independently control each of the elements of morphing. If you started to change the stroke path in the animation of letter morphing, you would have to adjust all the keyframes of the trim path, since the initially set values would no longer be suitable. Morphs are good and all, but they look much cooler when accompanied by additional details. It's time to figure out how to customize your lines and create a cool trail. Let's start with these stair-step lines. Create a path along which the letter will appear, and animate it using the trim path. Done. Now go inside the layer and duplicate the group with the shape. Reduce its stroke and parent the path of the duplicated shape to the main one using the Pick Whip tool. Now you can change the shape of the main line as you like, and all the additional lines will repeat it. Just duplicate the parented shape a few more times. Change the thickness of the stroke and do offsets on the trim path animation. And you're done. Now to a more complex example, which is the trail on this animation, which I've promised to tell you about. The easiest way to create such a trail is our Superlines script, in which you can do this in just a couple of clicks. If you don't have our script, then there is another, a little bit more labor-consuming way. So let's take the morphing animation that we did before. Open the content layers and duplicate the group with the shape. Let's make the stroke thinner, something like this, and add a couple of dashes in it. Yes, now press U and offset the trim path keyframes for a couple of frames. You've got a trail like that. Next, duplicate the shape group again and add the offset paths modifier. It must go after the trim path, which cuts the layer. You've got such an animation. Let's cut the rounded end of the group with an offset path now to get exactly the same trail as in the reference. And here there are two options. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages. In the first case, you can add another trim path, but after the offset path, and with its help cut the rounded edge. But now, during the animation, the edges of the stroke will go randomly all over the place, and you need to fix them. So let's animate the offset parameter to keep the edges always in place. The main drawback of this solution is a large number of extra keyframes and the difficulty of editing the animation. But at the same time, you can control the appearance of each stroke in the trail. And most importantly, all this is in one layer. The second method is based on the mask we'll create from a duplicate of the main layer. Select all shape groups in it and change the line width by several units more than the main one. Simply delete the group with the offset path. Let's change the type of cap on the strokes to projecting cap. I will change the color of this layer so that you can see the mask. Done. Select the bottom layer and select the Alpha Matte mode to create a mask for the trail. Select the trim path keyframes on the layer mask and shift it by a couple of frames to cut the round edge of the trail. Good, but now the edge of the lines is sharply cut off with a mask. To fix this, you need to create a precompose of these two layers, and apply two effects to it: Gaussian Blur and Levels. The first one will blur the edges and make them all rounded. And with the help of Levels, you can correct the alpha channel so that the lines are completely opaque. We will analyze this technique in more detail in the following lessons. We will imitate liquid animation using this technique. So as you can see, the result is about the same as with the first method. But for each of the trails, you will have to create a separate mask and precompose or adjustment layer. The pros are that you don't need to adjust the trim path offset parameter, but simply copy the layers and make them a mask. You can also note here such a small liquid effect, which is great for this kind of animation. The next setup is more about lettering. Later you will understand how it is used. But for now, we'll just figure out how to create it. It will be such a brush of lines created using shape modifiers. Draw a path. Keep only the stroke of small width. Add repeater and wiggle transform to this group. Using the first one, we will copy the lines. And using the second one, we will change their position. Don't forget about the hierarchy of modifiers. The one above will work first. We need the lines to be copied first, and then change their position. Null the position value in the repeater and make more copies. And then change the position value in the transform and set the wiggles parameter to 0. I recommend that you make the position value in the wiggle transform approximately the same on both axes, so the brush will look the same during sharp turns on the path. The base is ready. Now let's slightly reduce the stroke opacity to make the brush look more realistic. Add wiggle paths to make the brush look a little more interesting. And the final touch is the roughen edges effect. Usually it is used to create rough edges on layers, but in our case this effect will help to create a line similar to paint masks. The result is this brush. which can be revealed in the usual trim paths and used to draw all sorts of elements and letterings. You can experiment with shape modifiers and effects to get different brush variations. Here are a couple of examples created just this way. And the last type of lines is such a pseudo 3D stroke. It can come in handy when you need to reveal logos or text with imitation of volume. Draw any path with a stroke. Duplicate the shape group and repaint the lower one to a different, darker color. Now add a repeater to it. With the help of the number of copies and the change of the position in the repeater transform, you can control the line settings. Let's parent the path of this group to the upper path so that it is easier to modify the line. It remains to add a trim pass, with the help of which you can reveal this line. We're done with the setups. Now let's talk about a rarely used but nonetheless cool technique, called the bouncy path. It works great for line logos when it comes to creating an unfolding or unwrapping effect. Prior to After Effects 2018, you could have achieved such an effect only with the help of third-party scripts or after spending a lot of time on animating the path. But this version already includes the Create Nulls from Paths script, with the help of which you can parent the path points to the nulls and use them to control the animation. And thanks to this parenting, you can apply the elastic function to the position value from our Motion Tools panel. It will create damped oscillations that you can tune easily. Here's another example on a slightly more complex object. A cube. I created nulls in the same way, but some of them are in the same place. So I took one of the repeating nulls and parented to it the one that is in the same place. As for the parented null, I've simply hidden it from view. We do the same with all the duplicates. When all the nulls are parented, just animate the null positions from any point and tweak the offset between them. And just add elastic to each value in the same way. We've got such a cool animation. I've used the same technique when animating this logo. As you can see, adding a little randomness to the animation makes the result even cooler. Of course, working with a large number of nulls is quite difficult, so I advise you to always optimize your work. Parent nulls to each other to reduce the number of animated elements, and simply hide unwanted layers through the Shy panel. This will simplify your work to a great extent and make the animation process faster and more comfortable. As an example, I'll give you this animation. We will do something similar now. This animation had several difficulties at once. First, the lines in this logo are tilted, but they are always placed horizontally and cannot be redrawn with an ordinary stroke. Secondly, due to the fact that this is a solid figure, you cannot reveal it with the regular trim paths. But thanks to the Create Nulls from Paths script, all this can be easily solved. First, I created nulls from each path point. After that, I parented the nulls of each of the vertices of the letters to other nulls, so that it is easier to control the animation. I hid the extra nulls using Shy and kept only the controllers. I animated the position on each of the controllers, then added elastic, and got this animation with oscillations. Now I needed to reveal this line. I made a mask from a stroke that I added a trim path to develop a line. I'll make it a mask using Alpha Mate. Like this. The last challenge is to parent the mask layer to the main animation. And here, Create Nulls from Paths helps us once again. We've created the nulls of the path and parented them to the controllers. And everything is ready. With the help of animating the trim paths, we've completed the animation. As a result, we've got a beautiful animation that is very easy to edit. Wait, what is this? Okay, no worries, there's a solution. This small bug has appeared due to the fact that the reveal of the mask is not completely synchronous with the bounces in the letter. But it is very easy to fix. Open the mask nulls, which we've parented to the controllers, and animate them in the frames where problems have appeared. It is enough to change the position of the null by just one frame and then return it back. Now, after we moved just a couple of nulls, the animation looks smooth and neat. Unfortunately, there are situations when there is no way to avoid additional animation of nulls or paths, and sometimes you have to manually correct a few frames to get a good result. But there is an even cooler feature in the same script. It allows you to parent layers to any point in the path, and not just to the vertices. Like, for example, the ballerina's shoe in this animation. In fact, it is parented to the end trim paths parameter. I will show you how to do it. Take a layer with an animated trim paths. Select Path in it. Run the Create Nulls from Paths script, and click on the Trace Paths button. A null object containing the effect with the same name has been created. It works similarly to the trim paths. Null moves along the entire length of the path from 0 to 100, and you can parent any layers or objects to it. With the help of the Pick Whip tool, you can parent this effect to the end or start of the trim paths, so that the null follows the beginning or end of the line. Don't forget, after creating a trace paths, move the anchor point from the corner to the center of the null to avoid bugs and inconveniences. Now create a star. Set the anchor point in the center, and while holding down the Shift key, parent the star to the null. With this combination, you position the selected layer exactly in the place where the anchor point of the parent layer is located, and the scale and rotation parameters are copied all from the same parent layer. Add a scale animation to the star so that it disappears along with the line, and see what happens. Everything looks neat. The star follows exactly the end of the trim paths, and no matter how you modify the path, it will always be in the end. In the same way, you can animate various ropes with objects, pieces of clothing, and any objects that you need to parent to the path. This ends the first part of the lesson. We've looked at the basic techniques of Lines logo reveal. In the next part, I will introduce you to more advanced techniques, after which you will master all types of Lines reveal. And yes, we will analyze in detail how to make this super cool animation. Bye everyone, and I'll see you in the next lesson.